The autumn rain pelted against the windows of the modest Montecito mansion as Meghan Markle sat in her study, staring at the unopened letter that had arrived that morning. The royal seal glinted in the dim lamplight, and she knew without breaking the wax that this correspondence would change everything. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the elegant envelope, the weight of its contents seeming far heavier than the paper it was written on. Harry was upstairs with the children, reading bedtime stories in that gentle voice that had first captivated her years ago during their whirlwind courtship. The sound of his laughter drifting down the hallway felt like a cruel irony now, given what she suspected lay within the letter. She had been expecting this moment for months, ever since the legal proceedings had begun in earnest back in London. The past 3 years had been a roller coaster of emotions, public scrutiny, and legal battles that seemed to have no end. What had started as their brave decision to step back from royal duties had spiraled into something far more complex and damaging than either of them had anticipated. The media frenzy, the court cases, the family estrangement, it had all taken its toll on their marriage, their children, and their sense of identity. Meghan finally broke the seal with shaking fingers, unfolding the heavy cream paper that bore the official letterhead of the palace legal department. Her eyes scanned the formal language, but certain phrases jumped out at her like daggers: irreversible decision, permanent severance, and, most devastating of all, complete removal of all remaining royal privileges and protections. The letter explained in cold, legal terms that King Charles III had made his final determination regarding their status within the royal family. After extensive deliberation with his advisors, Parliament, and constitutional experts, he had decided that their continued public criticisms and legal challenges had made their position untenable. All remaining ties to the monarchy would be severed permanently, including Harry's place in the line of succession and any future inheritance rights for their children. Meghan's breath caught in her throat as she read the final paragraph, which outlined the timeline for the announcement. The decision would be made public within 72 hours, giving them a brief window to prepare their own statement if they chose to respond. After that, there would be no going back, no appeals process, no room for reconciliation. She set the letter down on her desk and buried her face in her hands, feeling the weight of everything they had lost and were about to lose pressing down on her shoulders. The fairy tale that had begun with such hope and promise had become a nightmare that seemed to have no end. She thought about their wedding day, the joy on Harry's face, the thousands of well-wishers lining the streets of Windsor, and the naive belief that love could conquer all obstacles. The irony wasn't lost on her that she had fought so hard for their independence, only to find that true independence from the royal family meant losing everything that had made their platform meaningful. Without their royal connection, their charitable work would suffer, their influence would diminish, and their children would grow up completely cut off from their father's heritage and birthright. Her phone buzzed with a text message from their publicist in Los Angeles, asking about rumors circulating in the British press about a major royal announcement. Meghan quickly typed back that she would call in the morning, not ready to face the media circus that would inevitably follow once the news broke. She needed time to think, to process, and, most importantly, to figure out how to tell Harry. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced Harry's return from putting the children to bed. Meghan quickly folded the letter and slipped it into the desk drawer, not ready to shatter the peaceful evening they had been enjoying. Harry appeared in the doorway with that boyish smile that still made her heart skip a beat, despite everything they had been through. "The little ones are finally asleep," he said, crossing the room to kiss the top of her head. Archie insisted on 3 more chapters of his adventure book, and Lilibet wanted to hear the princess story again. "I think she's starting to understand that her great-grandmother was once a real queen." The mention of the children's royal heritage hit Meghan like a physical blow. How could she tell them that their connection to that legacy was about to be severed forever? How could she explain to Archie that his father's family had essentially disowned them all? The weight of the secret felt unbearable, but she forced herself to smile and respond normally. "That's sweet. They love their bedtime stories with Daddy." She stood up from her desk, wrapping her arms around Harry's waist and breathing in his familiar scent. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine that everything was still okay, that they were just a normal family dealing with normal problems. Harry seemed to sense something was wrong, his journalist instincts still sharp despite his departure from his former life. "You seem tense tonight. Everything all right? No more legal drama, I hope?" The question hung in the air between them, and Meghan realized she couldn't keep the truth from him much longer. He would find out anyway when the announcement was made, and it would be better coming from her. But tonight felt too fragile, too precious to destroy with such devastating news. Just tired, she lied, hating herself for the deception. It's been a long day with the children, and I have some work calls to catch up on tomorrow. Harry nodded, accepting her explanation but still watching her with those perceptive blue eyes that saw too much. They had been through so much together that he could read her moods better than anyone, and she knew he sensed that something significant was weighing on her mind. They moved to the living room, where Harry poured them both a glass of wine from a bottle they had been saving for a special occasion. The irony of drinking it on what might be one of their darkest nights wasn't lost on either of them, though only Meghan understood the true gravity of the situation. As they sat together on the couch, Harry's arm around her shoulders, Meghan found herself memorizing every detail of the moment. The way the firelight danced across his face, the sound of his heartbeat beneath her cheek, the feeling of safety and love that had sustained them through every crisis. She knew that tomorrow everything would change, and this peaceful interlude would become just a memory. "Do you ever regret it?" Harry asked suddenly, his voice quiet in the dimly lit room. "Leaving everything behind, I mean. The security, the certainty, the family connections?" The question caught Meghan off guard, and she wondered if somehow he had sensed what was coming. "Do you?" she replied, deflecting while she tried to formulate an honest answer. Harry was quiet for a long moment, swirling the wine in his glass as he considered his response. "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if we had stayed and tried to work things out from the inside. But then, I remember how miserable you were, how the press was treating you, how impossible it felt to protect our family while remaining part of that system." Meghan felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to his words. He had given up everything for her and their children, and now it seemed that even their compromise solution was being taken away from them. The guilt was overwhelming, even though she knew that the decisions they had made were joint ones, born out of necessity rather than selfishness. "I love our life here," she said finally, and it wasn't entirely untrue. Despite the challenges, they had found moments of genuine happiness in California. Their children were thriving, they had meaningful work with their charitable foundation, and they had each other. "But I also know that our choices have had consequences we didn't anticipate." They talked late into the night about their hopes for the future, their dreams for their children, and the work they wanted to continue doing together. Harry spoke passionately about the veterans programs he was developing and the mental health initiatives they were planning to launch. Meghan found herself wondering how much of that work would be possible once their royal connection was completely severed. As they finally headed upstairs to bed, Meghan caught a glimpse of herself in the hallway mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed older, more careworn than the radiant bride who had walked down the aisle at St. George's Chapel just a few years earlier. The crown had been heavy, but losing it entirely felt somehow worse. She lay awake long after Harry had fallen asleep beside her, staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine a path forward. The letter had been clear that the decision was final, but Meghan couldn't accept that there was no possibility of reconciliation. King Charles was Harry's father, regardless of their current estrangement. Surely there had to be some way to bridge the gap, some gesture that could heal the wounds that had been festering for so long. By dawn, she had made her decision. She would reach out to the king directly, bypassing the lawyers and advisors who seemed determined to keep them at war with each other. It would be a risk, potentially opening herself up to further humiliation and rejection, but she had to try. For Harry's sake, for their children's sake, and for the sake of the family that had once welcomed her with such warmth. The next morning, Meghan woke early and slipped downstairs to her study before anyone else was awake. She pulled out the letter again, reading it one more time to make sure she hadn't misunderstood its contents. The words were just as harsh in the morning light, just as final and unforgiving. She opened her laptop and began to compose an email to the king's private secretary, requesting a personal audience. Her fingers moved slowly across the keyboard as she chose each word carefully, knowing that this might be her only chance to make her case. The tone had to be respectful but not subservient, urgent but not desperate, personal but not presumptuous. As she wrote, Meghan found herself thinking about the early days of her relationship with the royal family. There had been genuine warmth from Charles, who had seemed delighted to welcome her into the family. He had walked her down the aisle when her own father couldn't attend the wedding, and she remembered the kindness in his eyes during that moment. Surely some trace of that affection remained, buried beneath the hurt and disappointment of recent years. The email took her nearly 2 hours to perfect, and, when she finally sent it, Meghan felt both relief and terror. There was no guarantee that Charles would even read it, much less agree to meet with her. But she had taken the first step on what might be her last chance to salvage something from the wreckage of their relationship with the royal family. Harry found her in the study an hour later, still staring at her computer screen with a mixture of hope and dread. He immediately noticed the letter on her desk, and she watched his face change as he read its contents. The color drained from his cheeks, and his hands began to shake as the full implications of his father's decision sank in. "This can't be real," he whispered, looking up at her with eyes full of pain and disbelief. "He wouldn't actually cut us off completely. Not the children. They're his grandchildren." Meghan reached for his hand, squeezing it tightly as she saw the devastation in his expression. This was the moment she had been dreading, seeing the man she loved come to terms with his father's ultimate rejection. "I've reached out to request a meeting," she said quietly. "Maybe if we can talk to him directly, explain our position, there might still be a chance." Harry stared at her for a long moment, and she could see him cycling through anger, hurt, and, finally, a desperate kind of hope. "You think he'll see us?" "I don't know," Meghan admitted. "But we have to try. For the children, if nothing else. They deserve the chance to know their grandfather and their heritage, even if we've made mistakes along the way." As they sat together in the morning light, holding each other and trying to process the magnitude of what they faced, Meghan realized that this was either the end of their royal story or the beginning of their fight to write a different ending. The next few days would determine which it would be, and everything depended on whether King Charles still had room in his heart for the son who had chosen love over duty, and the woman who had tried to change an institution that ultimately proved too powerful to reform. The stakes had never been higher, and failure was not an option. Meghan steeled herself for the battle ahead, knowing that she was fighting not just for their family's future, but for the soul of a monarchy that had shaped centuries of history. The girl from Los Angeles who had once dreamed of being a princess was about to discover whether she had what it took to save a kingdom. The response from Buckingham Palace arrived faster than Meghan had dared to hope, though the brevity of the message left her unsure whether to be encouraged or concerned. Sir Edward Young, the King's private secretary, had written simply that His Majesty would grant her a private audience at Clarence House the following Tuesday at 3 o'clock. No mention was made of Harry being included in the meeting, and the formal tone suggested this would be more of a final reckoning than a reconciliation. Meghan stared at the email on her phone screen for the 100th time as her British Airways flight began its descent into London Heathrow. She had made the decision to travel alone, against Harry's protests and her own instincts. He had wanted to accompany her, to face his father together as they had faced every other crisis in their marriage. But Meghan knew that the complicated history between father and son might actually hinder rather than help her cause. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was returning to the city where she had once been welcomed as a breath of fresh air for the monarchy, a modern American actress who would help bring the royal family into the 21st century. Now she was flying back as something closer to a pariah, desperately hoping to undo years of damage and mistrust. As the plane touched down on British soil, Meghan felt the familiar mixture of anxiety and anticipation that London always evoked in her. This city held so many memories, some beautiful, some painful, all complicated. She remembered her first official engagement with Harry, the way the crowds had cheered, the feeling that she was part of something larger and more meaningful than anything she had experienced before. The private car that met her at the airport was unmarked and understated, a far cry from the royal motorcades that had once transported her through these same streets. Her security detail was minimal, just 2 officers who treated her with professional courtesy but none of the deference she had grown accustomed to during her brief time as a working royal. The message was clear: she was no longer under the crown's protection. Meghan had chosen to stay at a small boutique hotel in Belgravia rather than at any of the royal residences, wanting to maintain her independence while remaining close enough to Clarence House for easy travel. The suite was elegant and comfortable, but she barely noticed the luxurious appointments as she paced the sitting room, mentally rehearsing the speech she had been crafting for days. That evening, she called Harry to let him know she had arrived safely. He sounded tired and worried, having spent the day fielding calls from their legal team and publicist as rumors about the royal rift continued to circulate in the British press. The children had asked why Mommy had to go to London without them, and Harry had struggled to explain the situation in age-appropriate terms. "Any word from the palace about tomorrow?" Harry asked, his voice tense with anxiety. "Nothing beyond the appointment time," Meghan replied, settling into the plush armchair by the window that overlooked the quiet Belgravia Street. "I keep going over what I want to say, but I honestly don't know what approach will work best. Should I be apologetic? Defiant? Somewhere in between?" Harry was quiet for a moment, and she could picture him running his hands through his hair the way he always did when he was struggling with a difficult decision. "Just be yourself," he said finally. "That's who he fell in love with at the beginning, remember? Before all the drama and the legal battles. Just be the woman who wanted to make a difference, who loved our family enough to fight for us." After they hung up, Meghan spent hours walking around London, reacquainting herself with the city that had briefly been her home. She passed by some of their old haunts, the restaurant where Harry had proposed, the theater where they had attended their first official royal engagement, the park where they had taken long walks during their engagement period when the future had seemed so bright and full of possibility. The next morning dawned grey and drizzly, typical London weather that matched her mood perfectly. Meghan dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing a navy blue dress that was elegant but not flashy, professional but not severe. She wanted to strike exactly the right note, respectful of the institution and the man she was meeting, but confident in her own worth and the validity of her position. The drive to Clarence House took only 20 minutes, but it felt like the longest journey of her life. As the car pulled through the familiar gates, Meghan was struck by how little had changed since her last visit over 2 years ago. The same immaculate gardens, the same imposing Georgian architecture, the same sense of centuries of tradition weighing down on everything like a heavy blanket. Sir Edward Young met her at the entrance, his demeanor polite but distinctly cool. He had always been one of the more traditional courtiers, someone who viewed the Sussexes' departure as a betrayal of everything the monarchy stood for. His greeting was correct but lacking any warmth, and Meghan realized that even getting to this meeting had been a significant concession on the king's part. "Your Majesty has allocated 30 minutes for this audience," Sir Edward informed her as they walked through the familiar corridors lined with portraits of previous monarchs. "He asks that you please be direct and concise in your presentation." The formal language stung, reducing what Meghan had hoped would be a heartfelt family conversation to something that sounded more like a business meeting with a difficult client. But she swallowed her pride and nodded her understanding, knowing that she was lucky to get any time at all with the king. King Charles was waiting in his study, the same room where they had shared tea and pleasant conversation during happier times. He looked older than when she had last seen him, the weight of the crown having aged him considerably over the past few years. His expression was carefully neutral as he gestured for her to take a seat across from his desk, but she could see the wariness in his eyes. "Meghan," he said simply, his voice carrying none of the warmth she remembered from their early interactions. "You requested this meeting. I'm listening." The formal address hit her like a slap. No, my dear, no acknowledgement of their familial relationship, just her name spoken like she was any other petitioner seeking an audience with the monarch. But Meghan had prepared herself for this possibility, and she forced herself to remain composed as she began her carefully rehearsed appeal. "Your Majesty, I want to begin by saying how sorry I am for the pain that our family has caused yours over these past few years. I know that our public statements and legal actions have been difficult for you and for the institution you represent. That was never our intention, though I understand that impact matters more than intention in this context." Charles listened without interruption, his face giving away nothing of what he was thinking. Meghan continued, drawing on every persuasive skill she had learned during her acting career and her brief time as a working royal. "I also want you to know that Harry loves you deeply, despite everything that has happened between us all. He talks about you constantly to our children, sharing stories of his childhood and helping them understand the importance of their grandfather's role in history. Whatever our differences as adults, he has never forgotten that you are his father first and foremost. For just a moment, she thought she saw a flicker of emotion cross the king's face at the mention of Harry and the grandchildren, but he quickly composed himself and remained silent, waiting for her to continue. Meghan took a deep breath and moved into the heart of her argument. I understand that you feel we have damaged the reputation of the crown through our public criticisms and legal challenges. I won't pretend that we've handled everything perfectly. We've made mistakes, said things in anger that we now regret, and allowed our hurt feelings to cloud our judgment at times. She paused, searching his face for any sign that her words were having an impact. But I would ask you to consider the position we were in when we made those statements. We felt abandoned by the institution, unsupported in the face of vicious media attacks, and powerless to protect our family while remaining within the system. Everything we did was born out of desperation, not malice. Charles finally spoke, his voice measured and careful. And yet the damage was done regardless of your motivation. The monarchy's reputation has suffered significantly due to your public accusations. The trust that the British people place in this institution has been shaken, and that has consequences that extend far beyond our family dynamics. His words were spoken without anger, but the underlying disappointment was unmistakable. Meghan felt the weight of his displeasure settling on her shoulders, but she pressed on, knowing this might be her only chance to make her case. You're absolutely right, and I take full responsibility for my part in that damage. But I would argue that the monarchy is stronger when it can acknowledge its mistakes and work to correct them. The issues we raised about racism, mental health support, and media manipulation, these weren't manufactured controversies. They were real problems that needed to be addressed. She leaned forward slightly, her voice becoming more passionate as she spoke from the heart. I truly believed, and still believe, that the royal family could be a force for positive change in the world. That's why I was so excited to join the family in the beginning. I saw an opportunity to use this incredible platform to make a real difference in people's lives. Charles studied her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing her words carefully. And what exactly are you proposing now, Meghan? What would you have me do with this verdict that has already been reached after months of careful consideration? This was the moment she had been building toward, and Meghan knew she had to choose her words carefully. I'm asking you to consider a different path forward. Instead of completely severing our ties, what if we could find a way to rebuild trust gradually? Harry and I are willing to accept significant restrictions on our public statements and activities. We're willing to work within whatever parameters you establish. But please don't cut our children off from their heritage entirely. She could see that she had his attention now, and she pressed her advantage. Archie and Lilibet are innocent in all of this. They didn't choose the circumstances of their birth or the conflicts that have divided our families. They deserve the chance to know their grandfather, to understand their place in this incredible institution, and to potentially contribute to its future success. For the first time since she had entered the room, King Charles showed genuine emotion, his expression softening slightly at the mention of his grandchildren. The children, he said quietly, almost to himself. They are caught in the middle of something they had no part in creating. Meghan sensed an opening and leaned into it. Exactly. And, Harry, he's struggling so much with this estrangement from you and from William. He tries to hide it, but I can see how much pain he's in. He never wanted to choose between his family and his wife. He just wanted to find a way to protect us while still serving the crown. The room fell silent for several minutes, and Meghan could practically see the wheels turning in Charles's mind as he wrestled with competing loyalties and concerns. Finally, he stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the gardens where he had once played with his own sons. The decision I announced, he said without turning around, was not made lightly. It was the culmination of months of legal and constitutional advice, consideration of precedent, and careful thought about what was best for the institution in the long term. Meghan felt her heart sinking, interpreting his words as a gentle but firm rejection of her appeal. But then, he turned back to face her, and she saw something in his expression that gave her a glimmer of hope. However, he continued, I am not unmoved by your arguments, particularly regarding the children. They are, as you say, innocent parties in this conflict. And, Harry. His voice trailed off, and Meghan could see the pain of a father who loved his son but felt betrayed by his choices. Charles returned to his desk and sat down, fixing her with a steady gaze. "I am willing to consider a probationary period. A chance for your family to demonstrate that you can rebuild trust and work constructively within appropriate boundaries. But the terms would be strict, and there would be no tolerance for further public criticism or legal challenges." Meghan's heart began to race with excitement, but she forced herself to remain calm and focused. What would those terms look like? The king opened a folder on his desk and withdrew a document that appeared to have been prepared in advance, suggesting that he had been considering this possibility even before their meeting. Complete cessation of all legal action against the crown and royal family members. A formal apology for past statements that damaged the institution's reputation. Submission of all future public statements and media appearances for review by palace communications staff. And a commitment to focus your charitable work on causes that complement rather than compete with existing royal patronages. The terms were harsh, essentially requiring them to surrender most of their independence and submit to the same kind of institutional control they had fled California to escape. But, as Meghan listened, she realized that this was likely the best offer she was going to receive, and it was infinitely better than the complete severance that had seemed inevitable just hours earlier. How long would this probationary period last, she asked, her mind already racing through the implications and challenges of such an arrangement. 2 years, Charles replied firmly. During which time your behavior and statements will be carefully monitored. If you successfully demonstrate that you can work within these parameters, we can discuss a more permanent arrangement. If not. He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Meghan nodded slowly, understanding the magnitude of what he was offering and what it would cost them to accept. I would need to discuss this with Harry before giving you a final answer, but I can tell you that I am deeply grateful for your willingness to consider an alternative to complete estrangement. Charles stood, indicating that their meeting was drawing to a close. You have 48 hours to provide your response. After that, the original verdict stands, and this offer will not be renewed. As Meghan prepared to leave, the king surprised her by walking around his desk and offering her his hand. Despite everything that has happened between us, I want you to know that I harbor no personal animosity toward you. You came into this family with good intentions, and, in many ways, the failure was ours for not better preparing you for the challenges you would face. The unexpected kindness in his words nearly brought tears to her eyes, and, for a moment, she could see the man who had once welcomed her so warmly into the family. Thank you for that, and for this opportunity, she managed to say. I know how difficult this decision must be for you. As she walked back through the corridors of Clarence House, Meghan felt a complex mixture of emotions. Relief that complete disaster had been averted, anxiety about whether Harry would agree to such restrictive terms, and determination to make this second chance work if they decided to accept it. The battle was far from over, but, for the first time in months, she had reason to hope that their family might find a way forward together. The flight back to Los Angeles felt interminable, every minute stretching like an hour as Meghan wrestled with how to present the king's offer to Harry. She had spent the 2 days following her meeting with Charles walking the streets of London, trying to process the magnitude of the decision they now faced. The probationary terms were more restrictive than she had hoped, but they represented their only path back to the royal family and their children's birthright. During those 2 days, she had also arranged a secret meeting with William at Kensington Palace, hoping to gauge whether Harry's brother might be an ally in rebuilding family bonds. The encounter had been stilted and uncomfortable, with William maintaining a cold politeness that made clear he still harbored significant resentment about their public accusations and the damage to the family's reputation. If you're serious about making amends, William had said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who would one day be king, then, you need to understand that trust is rebuilt through actions, not words. Father is offering you more than many of us think you deserve. Don't waste this opportunity. His words had stung, but they had also reinforced her understanding of how precarious their position remained. Even if Charles was willing to consider reconciliation, the broader royal family would be watching every move they made, ready to pounce on any sign that they were reverting to their previous behavior. Now, as the plane descended into LAX, Meghan could see Harry waiting for her at the private aviation terminal, his face a mixture of hope and anxiety. She had deliberately avoided discussing the details of her meetings during their brief phone conversations, wanting to have this crucial conversation in person where she could gauge his reactions and help him process the complex emotions she knew he was experiencing. The drive from the airport to their Montecito home was mostly silent, both of them sensing that they were at a crossroads that would determine the direction of their lives for years to come. Harry reached for her hand as they pulled into their driveway, squeezing it gently in a gesture that conveyed both support and nervousness about what she was about to tell him. Once the children were settled with their nanny for the evening, Meghan and Harry retreated to their study, where she carefully explained every detail of her conversation with King Charles. She watched Harry's face cycle through a range of emotions as she described the terms of the probationary offer: relief that complete banishment had been avoided, frustration at the restrictive conditions, and deep sadness at how far their relationship with his family had deteriorated. "So essentially, we would be giving up everything we fought for when we left," Harry said when she had finished, his voice hollow with disappointment. "Our freedom to speak our truth, our ability to control our own narrative, our independence to choose our own path. We'd be right back where we started, except under even tighter scrutiny." Meghan had anticipated this reaction, and she understood his frustration completely. "That's one way to look at it," she said gently. "But there's another perspective. We'd be gaining back your relationship with your father, the children's connection to their heritage, and the platform that comes with royal status to do meaningful charitable work." Harry stood and began pacing the room, a habit he had developed during times of stress. "But at what cost, Meghan? You saw how miserable you were when we were constantly being monitored and controlled. Do you really think you can go back to submitting every statement for approval, having your every move scrutinized and criticized?" The question hung in the air between them, and Meghan realized that Harry was asking her to make a sacrifice that he wasn't sure he could ask of her in good conscience. She had been the one who had suffered most acutely under the constraints of royal life, dealing with racist attacks from the media and feeling abandoned by the institution when she needed support most. "I think I'm older and wiser now," she said after a long pause. "When we first joined the family, I thought I could change things quickly, that I could use my voice to push for immediate reforms. I understand now that change in an institution this old and traditional happens much more slowly. Maybe I can work within the system more effectively if I approach it differently." Harry stopped pacing and looked at her with an expression of profound love and concern. "I need you to be completely honest with me, Meg. Are you saying this because you genuinely believe it's the right path, or because you feel guilty about what our choices have cost me and the children?" It was a perceptive question that cut straight to the heart of her internal conflict. Over the past 3 years, Meghan had watched Harry struggle with the loss of his family relationships, particularly his estrangement from his father and brother. She had seen how much it cost him to maintain their independent stance, even when he publicly supported their decisions. "Both, if I'm being completely honest," she admitted. "I do feel responsible for the fact that you're essentially cut off from your family. And I can see how much it hurts you, even when you try to hide it from me. But I also genuinely believe that this might be our best chance to find a middle ground that allows us to maintain our values while rebuilding those relationships." They spent hours that night discussing every aspect of the king's offer, weighing the potential benefits against the very real costs of accepting such restrictive terms. Harry was particularly concerned about the requirement that all their future statements be reviewed by palace communications staff, knowing how often they had clashed with that same department during their time as working royals. "They never understood our perspective when we were part of the family," he pointed out. "What makes us think they'll be more supportive now, when we're essentially on probation? They'll be looking for any excuse to prove that we can't be trusted." Meghan acknowledged his concerns but countered with her own analysis of their current situation. "If we reject this offer, where does that leave us? Completely cut off from the royal family forever, our children growing up with no connection to their father's side of the family, and our charitable work limited by the fact that we're no longer associated with the crown." The conversation continued late into the night, with both of them playing devil's advocate for different positions. They discussed the impact on their children, their charitable foundation, their relationship with the British public, and their own personal happiness. It was one of the most difficult conversations of their marriage, forcing them to confront hard truths about their choices and their future. The next morning, they called an emergency meeting with their closest advisors, their lawyer, publicist, and the director of their charitable foundation. The team gathered in their living room, creating an impromptu war room where they could analyze the king's offer from every possible angle. Their lawyer was skeptical about the legal implications of agreeing to halt all litigation against the royal family, pointing out that some of their cases involved important principles about press intrusion and privacy rights that extended beyond their personal interests. If you withdraw these cases now, he warned, it sets a precedent that could make it harder for others to seek similar protections in the future. Their publicist was more pragmatic, focusing on the reputational benefits and risks of either accepting or rejecting the offer. From a public relations standpoint, reconciling with the royal family would be enormously beneficial, she explained. The narrative of redemption and family healing would resonate with audiences on both sides of the Atlantic. But, if you accept and, then, fail to meet the terms of the probation, the backlash would be severe. The foundation director raised concerns about how the restrictions might impact their charitable work, particularly their ability to advocate for causes that might be seen as politically sensitive. Some of our most effective work has involved pushing for policy changes and speaking out on issues where the traditional royal approach has been more cautious, she noted. We need to consider whether we can still make a meaningful impact under these constraints. After hearing from their advisors, Meghan and Harry retreated to their bedroom to continue their private deliberations. The 48-hour deadline was approaching rapidly, and they knew they needed to reach a decision soon. The weight of choosing not just their own future, but potentially their children's relationship with an entire side of their family, felt overwhelming. I keep thinking about Archie and Lily, Harry said as they sat on their bed, surrounded by the normal detritus of family life, children's toys, laundry waiting to be put away, books they had been meaning to read. They're so young now that they don't really understand what they're missing. But, as they get older, they're going to ask questions about their grandfather, their uncle, their cousins. How do we explain that we had a chance to repair those relationships and chose not to take it? Meghan nodded, having wrestled with the same concerns. But, we also have to consider what kind of example we're setting for them about standing up for your principles. If we accept terms that we fundamentally disagree with just to maintain family relationships, what does that teach them about compromise versus capitulation? The moral complexity of their situation seemed to have no clear resolution. Every path forward involved significant sacrifices and uncertain outcomes. They were essentially being asked to choose between their independence and their family connections, with no guarantee that choosing family would lead to genuine reconciliation rather than merely a superficial truce. As the deadline approached, Meghan found herself thinking about her own childhood and the family relationships that had shaped her understanding of loyalty, forgiveness, and compromise. Her parents' divorce had taught her that sometimes love wasn't enough to bridge fundamental differences, but she had also learned that families could find new ways to function and support each other even after devastating conflicts. I think we need to try, she said finally, the words coming out in a rush as if she had been afraid to voice them. Not because I think it will be easy, or because I'm certain it will work out, but because the regret of not trying might be worse than the difficulty of attempting reconciliation. Harry looked at her for a long moment, searching her face for any sign that she was making this decision out of obligation rather than genuine conviction. Are you sure? Because once we accept these terms, there's no going back. If we fail to meet the conditions or decide we can't live with the restrictions, we'll be in an even worse position than we are now. Meghan took his hands in hers, feeling the calluses from his polo playing and the familiar warmth that had comforted her through every crisis of their relationship. I'm sure that I want to try. I'm sure that our children deserve the chance to know their grandfather. And I'm sure that you deserve the opportunity to rebuild your relationship with your father, even if it means we have to swallow our pride and accept some restrictions on our freedom. With less than 6 hours remaining before the deadline, they crafted their response to King Charles, accepting his offer while requesting minor modifications to some of the terms. They asked for quarterly reviews rather than constant monitoring of their statements, the right to continue their existing charitable partnerships even if they weren't officially royal patronages, and assurance that their children would be included in appropriate family gatherings and traditions. The email was sent at 11:47 p.m. London time, just minutes before the deadline expired. As they watched the message disappear into cyberspace, both Meghan and Harry felt a complex mixture of relief, anticipation, and terror about what they had just committed themselves to. "Whatever happens next," Harry said, pulling her close as they prepared for bed, "we're in this together. We've made this choice as a team, and we'll face whatever comes as a team." Meghan nodded, though she couldn't shake the feeling that they had just stepped onto a tightrope stretched over a very deep chasm. Success would mean healing one of the most public family rifts in recent memory and securing their children's place in history. Failure would mean not just personal disappointment, but global humiliation and the permanent loss of relationships that had once meant everything to Harry. As she drifted off to sleep, Meghan found herself praying to whatever forces governed the universe that they had made the right choice, and that love and determination would be enough to bridge the canyon of hurt and mistrust that separated them from the family they desperately wanted to rejoin. The response from Buckingham Palace arrived within 12 hours of their acceptance, faster than any official royal communication Meghan could remember receiving. King Charles had agreed to their requested modifications with only minor adjustments. Quarterly reviews would indeed replace constant monitoring, and the children would be welcomed at appropriate family events, though their participation would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis depending on the family's behavior during the probationary period. The next 6 months became a delicate dance of rehabilitation and reconstruction that tested every aspect of Meghan and Harry's relationship, both with each other and with the institution they were trying to rejoin. The formal apology they were required to issue generated massive global media attention, with supporters and critics analyzing every word choice and tone for signs of genuine remorse versus calculated public relations maneuvering. Meghan found the process of submitting their statements for palace review more humiliating than she had anticipated. Their communications team would draft speeches, social media posts, and interview responses, only to receive them back covered in corrections and suggestions that often fundamentally altered their intended message. The quarterly reviews became tense affairs where palace officials dissected their every public appearance and private meeting, looking for evidence of compliance or signs of backsliding. The most difficult challenge came 4 months into their probationary period, when a documentary crew approached them about participating in a project examining mental health advocacy among public figures. The project would have been perfectly aligned with their charitable goals and personal experiences, but the palace communications department was concerned about the potential for uncontrolled questions about their royal experiences. The negotiations over their participation became a proxy battle for larger questions about how much independence they would truly have under the new arrangement. Meghan and Harry argued that mental health advocacy was one of their core charitable focuses and that refusing to participate would undermine their credibility in that space. Palace officials countered that the documentary format was inherently risky and that their probationary status required extra caution about any media appearances. The standoff lasted for weeks, with both sides bringing in lawyers and communications experts to argue their positions. Meghan found herself particularly frustrated by what she saw as the palace's fundamental misunderstanding of how modern media and advocacy worked. The old model of carefully controlled royal communications seemed increasingly outdated in an era where authenticity and direct engagement were valued over formal statements and traditional protocols. Harry struggled with different aspects of their new reality, particularly the impact on his relationship with his military veteran advocacy work. Many of his veteran contacts were uncomfortable with what they saw as his return to an establishment that they felt had not adequately supported service members and their families. Several organizations quietly distanced themselves from his involvement, concerned that association with the royal family would compromise their ability to advocate for veterans' needs. The strain began to show in their personal relationship as well. Meghan noticed that Harry was becoming increasingly withdrawn and irritable, snapping at the children over minor infractions and spending hours alone in his study rather than engaging with family activities. She recognized the signs of the depression and anxiety that had plagued him during their most difficult periods as working royals, and she worried that their attempt to repair family relationships was coming at the cost of his mental health. Their first quarterly review in March was conducted via video conference, with King Charles joining from Buckingham Palace along with several senior advisors and communications staff. The tone was formal but not openly hostile, as palace officials presented a detailed analysis of every public statement, appearance, and charitable activity the couple had undertaken during their first 3 months of probation. Overall, the assessment was cautiously positive, though several areas for improvement were noted. Palace officials expressed concern about a social media post Meghan had made supporting a Black Lives Matter organization, arguing that it could be interpreted as taking a political stance inappropriate for someone associated with the royal family. They also questioned Harry's participation in a podcast discussing military mental health, suggesting that some of his comments about leadership failures could be seen as implicit criticism of government policies. Meghan felt her frustration boiling over during the review, particularly when one advisor suggested that her advocacy for women's rights organizations needed to be more carefully balanced to avoid appearing to take sides on controversial issues. With respect, she said, her voice carefully controlled but carrying an edge of steel, women's rights shouldn't be controversial in 2025. If the royal family can't support basic human dignity and equality, then perhaps this arrangement isn't going to work after all. The tension in the virtual meeting room was palpable, and Meghan immediately regretted her outburst. King Charles intervened before any of his advisors could respond, his voice calm but firm. "I think we all understand that this process involves adjustments for everyone involved. Perhaps we could focus on constructive solutions rather than relitigating philosophical differences." The incident became a turning point in their probationary period, forcing both sides to confront the fundamental question of whether genuine reconciliation was possible or whether they were merely engaging in an elaborate performance designed to avoid public embarrassment. In the weeks following the review, Meghan received several private communications from palace staff suggesting ways she could modify her advocacy work to make it more palatable to traditional royal sensibilities. The breaking point came in May, when Archie asked his father why they couldn't visit his grandfather like his classmates visited their grandparents. Harry had been carefully explaining their situation to the children in age-appropriate terms, but Archie's innocent question highlighted the absurdity of their current arrangement. They were technically reconciled with the royal family, but the children had still not had any direct contact with their grandfather or uncle since the probationary period began. Meghan decided to reach out directly to King Charles, bypassing the official channels that had become increasingly frustrating and bureaucratic. She wrote a personal letter, handwritten on simple stationery, asking whether it might be possible to arrange a private meeting between the king and his grandchildren, away from media attention and official protocols. The response surprised her with its warmth and immediacy. Charles wrote back within days, inviting the entire family to spend a weekend at Balmoral in July, during the traditional summer break when the royal family gathered at the Scottish estate. The invitation came with no conditions or restrictions, just a grandfather's desire to spend time with grandchildren he barely knew. The preparation for their Balmoral visit became an exercise in nervous anticipation for the entire family. Meghan and Harry spent weeks coaching the children on basic royal etiquette while trying not to make the upcoming visit seem intimidating or artificial. They wanted Archie and Lilibet to be themselves while also understanding that they would be meeting some of the most famous and powerful people in the world. The drive through the Scottish Highlands to Balmoral brought back a flood of memories for both Harry and Meghan. This was where Harry had spent some of his happiest childhood moments, where the royal family could relax and be more informal than was possible at Buckingham Palace or Windsor Castle. Meghan remembered her own first visit to Balmoral during their engagement period, when she had felt welcomed and included in family traditions that went back generations. King Charles was waiting on the front steps when their car pulled up, a gesture of respect and affection that immediately set a positive tone for the visit. He looked older than when Meghan had last seen him, but his smile was genuine as he approached their vehicle. The moment that followed would remain etched in Meghan's memory forever, the sight of her father-in-law embracing his son for the first time in over 3 years, both men fighting back tears as years of hurt and misunderstanding seemed to melt away in that single gesture. The children initially hung back shyly, uncertain how to relate to this distinguished stranger who was technically their grandfather but felt like someone they had only heard about in stories. Charles, however, proved to be a natural with young children, getting down on their level and engaging them with stories about the castle's history and the animals that lived on the estate. Within hours, Archie was following his grandfather around the gardens, asking endless questions about the plants and wildlife, while Lilibet had somehow convinced the future King of England to participate in an elaborate tea party with her dolls. Watching her children bond with their grandfather, Meghan felt a profound sense of relief and vindication for the difficult choices they had made to reach this point. The weekend became a masterclass in careful diplomacy, as the extended family navigated their first gathering in years. William and Catherine arrived on Saturday morning with their children, creating a slightly awkward but not hostile dynamic as the cousins met and began to play together. The adults maintained polite conversation while watching carefully for signs of tension or underlying resentment. Sunday morning brought an unexpected moment of breakthrough when Charles asked Harry to join him for their traditional walk around the estate grounds. Meghan watched from the castle windows as father and son walked side by side, their body language gradually relaxing as they covered familiar paths that held decades of shared memories. When they returned an hour later, both men looked emotionally drained but somehow lighter, as if a burden they had been carrying for years had finally been acknowledged and set down. Harry later told Meghan that they had talked honestly about their respective perspectives on the events of recent years, not to relitigate old arguments but to understand how each had experienced the pain of their estrangement. The final test of their reconciliation came on Sunday evening, when the entire family gathered for a traditional Highland Games competition on the estate grounds. It was a long-standing Balmoral tradition that allowed for playful competition while maintaining the informal atmosphere that made these family gatherings special. Meghan found herself competing in a sack race alongside Catherine, both women laughing as they stumbled and fell in their attempts to reach the finish line. The moment was captured by the estate photographer, and later Meghan would reflect on how that image, two sisters-in-law who had once been portrayed as bitter rivals, now laughing together while their children cheered them on, symbolized the possibility of healing and new beginnings. As they prepared to leave Balmoral on Monday morning, King Charles pulled Meghan aside for a private conversation in his study. "I want you to know," he said, his voice carrying the weight of careful consideration, "that this weekend has reminded me why I believed in your potential when you first joined our family. You and Harry have raised remarkable children, and seeing them here, in this place that means so much to our family history, feels like a completion of something that was broken." Meghan felt tears welling up in her eyes as she listened to his words. "Thank you for giving us this chance," she replied. "I know it couldn't have been easy, given everything that happened between us." Charles nodded thoughtfully. "Families are complicated entities, and ours more than most due to the public nature of our lives. But I've come to understand that the strength of an institution lies not in its ability to avoid making mistakes, but in its capacity to learn from them and find ways to heal and grow stronger." The drive back to London felt triumphant, with both children chattering excitedly about their adventures at Balmoral and making plans for future visits. Harry seemed more relaxed and genuinely happy than Meghan had seen him in years, the weight of family estrangement finally lifted from his shoulders. 6 months later, as their probationary period officially ended, Meghan and Harry received a formal letter from the palace announcing that their rehabilitation had been successful and that they were being welcomed back as full members of the royal family, with modified roles that acknowledged both their experience and their unique perspectives. The announcement generated global media attention, with commentators analyzing the significance of the reconciliation for the monarchy's future. For Meghan, however, the most meaningful moment came a week later when Archie asked casually at breakfast when they would be visiting Grandpa Charles again, treating the relationship as a natural and permanent part of his life. As she watched her son spread jam on his toast while planning his next adventure with his grandfather, Meghan reflected on the long journey that had brought them to this point. The battles had been real, the pain had been genuine, and the costs had been significant. But, sitting in her London kitchen, watching her children chat excitedly about their place in a family that stretched back centuries, she knew that the fight for reconciliation had been worth every difficult moment. The girl from Los Angeles who had once dreamed of being a princess had learned that real fairy tales don't end with happily ever after, they continue with the daily work of building relationships, bridging differences, and choosing love over pride. And, in that ongoing story, she had finally found her true role, not as a perfect royal or a flawless rebel, but as a mother, wife, and family member committed to healing and hope.